All right. Good afternoon. My name is Brian Lantz, and we'll be continuing our discussion today of Alexander Hamilton and the importance of Alexander Hamilton in terms of principle today. And I'd first like to just point out and remind people that our pamphlet that we've had in circulation for over the last year is titled "The United States Joins the New Silk Road: A Hamiltonian Vision for an Economic Renaissance," and has the perspective of linking North America, really all of the Americas, via the Bering Straits into Eurasia, and from Eurasia into Africa and so forth, the World Silk Road, the World Land Bridge. But we subtitled the pamphlet "A Hamiltonian Vision for an Economic Renaissance." Now, so definitely something to pick up. But if you've been following the media, including last night on PBS, there was a special titled "Hamilton's America," which had to do with this Broadway production, Hamilton, and so forth. And I have to say that this is what's turning the world away from, certainly from the Obama administration, from the Bush and Obama administrations. It's not turning them away from Hamilton. In fact, the new Silk Road, the One Belt, One Road, is Hamilton's vision come back to us. When we look at it, we're really looking in the mirror in terms of our own history. But let's just move quickly to a few of the just recent developments that underscore the kind of paradigm choice and kind of realignment that's going on right now in terms of the choice between what used to be known as the American system versus the British system, the Hamiltonian system versus the Adam Smith system. First of all, as you may know, President Duterte of the Philippines is today in Japan, and over the last several days was in China. In China, Duterte announced that the United States economically and militarily had lost, that the Philippines as a nation is turning directly to China. Duterte wasn't simply speaking for himself. He was there with 200 businessmen from the Philippines. And they were there committed to a rebuilding of the Philippines economy and collaboration with China and other countries in Asia to accomplish that. And as Duterte made very clear, he was not interested in confrontation over the South China Sea or similar things that the Obama pivot has involved, the attempted Obama pivot towards Asia, but instead cooperation with the One Belt and One Road. And some $9 billion worth of economic agreements were reached. I think the total was $9 billion worth of soft loans were arranged between private banks in China as well as the government of China with the Philippines. And these projects that are going to be built involve railroads, hospitals, drug clinics, a healthcare infrastructure initiative, other aspects of what's going to take to rebuild the Philippines back up as a viable economy. So again, this is not, I want to underscore, this is not that the country of the Philippines or President Duterte of the Philippines is turning away from the United States. It's turning to Hamilton in principle. And that'll lead us into what we have to discuss today. But this PBS show I mentioned just briefly, Hamilton's America, I mean, you had President George W. Bush up there, who I'm sure has not read anything. He certainly doesn't remember anything about Alexander Hamilton, if he ever read anything about Alexander Hamilton. And President Barack Obama, and two former Treasury secretaries waxing poetic about how great Alexander Hamilton was. But of course, what they had to say had nothing to do with Alexander Hamilton. As Keisha Rogers commented, Alexander Hamilton would be rolling over in his grave. He may be rolling over in his grave if he heard this or saw this going on. So today we'll be discussing Alexander Hamilton's final major report to the Congress, requested report as Treasury Secretary, as the first Treasury Secretary of the United States, to the Congress, the report on manufacturers. What underscores the importance of this, I think, is to say very directly that there is another candidate for the presidency that you may not know about. And that is the presidency, the presidential ticket of LaRouche and Hamilton. Lyndon LaRouche and Alexander Hamilton.
Can I write that in on my ballot?
You can write that in, yes you can. But this is a campaign of principle. We can already see, I think, if we look at where this presidential race is going, this creepy clown show, as someone called it, of a presidential race, that we're going to come out of this election paralyzed as a nation. The divisions are deep. And it's not simply in terms of these two personalities, the images that are projected by the media of these two personalities. It's deeper. The kind of gridlock that already has existed with the Congress, with the one shining, I think really shining exception, the passage of the JASTA bill, the Justice Against Sponsors of Terrorism Act, that the 9/11 families and ourselves and others put through in the final days of the congressional session before the break. But that was the exception. The gridlock that's existed in Washington, the really dysfunction of government, is going to continue out of this election. Mr. LaRouche is warning of this very directly, that the anger, the rage felt by the American people against both Trump and Hillary and Obama, this is not going to go away. And it's only going to be addressed. This crisis in the country is only going to be addressed by going to fundamental principle again. And that means going back to the ticket, if you will, of LaRouche and Hamilton, going back to the principles of Alexander Hamilton. That's not to say we're going back in time. It's to say that what Hamilton and his allies, George Washington, President George Washington, of course, Gouverneur Morris, others that came along, John Marshall, before him, the Circle, the New York administration, as it's sometimes referred to, that became the core of the first Washington presidency. That team, Hamilton, established the United States necessarily on principle. That is, the decisions made in terms of the economy and in terms of the direction of the nation were not left to market forces. What was established was principle. What was established was the role of the government, our government, to provide a direction forward of progress, grounded in the rapid development, the rapid progress of productivity of the citizenry of the country, per capita. Right? And that based on scientific and technological progress. And it was the role of government to ensure that process occurred. Think of Kennedy's space program as a more modern representation of a science driver to the economy. When we talk about LaRouche and Hamilton, we're speaking directly to what LaRouche has defined over the last 2 years in terms of 4 laws, my 4 laws, which is these emphasized, are a distillation of the 4 papers by Alexander Hamilton to the U.S. Congress, which became the fundamental building blocks of the nation, something that George W. Bush or Barack Obama or recent Treasury secretaries know nothing about in principle. But if you take Alexander Hamilton's first report, which we discussed last week, the paper on restoring the public credit, this is really the equivalent of what we're proposing, Mr. LaRouche and ourselves are proposing now, in the form of the reenactment of Glass-Steagall. A writing off of worthless financial paper, a reorganization of the credit of the nation to foster economic development. We also discussed last week the report on the National Bank, otherwise known as the second report on the restoration of the public credit. The report on the National Bank is again what is required today, whether it's in the form of a national bank as such or an equivalent, such as the equivalent under Franklin Roosevelt, the Reconstruction Finance Corporation, a government entity created to extend credit, to create and extend credit for earmarked projects to foster high rates of employment, rising productivity, and advancing standards of living. That's required today, just as then. And likewise, the idea of national credit itself that I'm referring to. Those are three of LaRouche's 3 laws, right? The Glass-Steagall, National Bank, National Credit, and the fourth is a fusion driver program, a crash program to develop fusion energy, including in terms of space and space exploration, the development of helium-3 on the moon, but also the development of fusion propulsion is critical to ensuring that we can move men and women from Earth into the moon and from moon on to Mars and so forth with the kind of rapidity required, the speed required to ensure that we have men and women of sound mind and body who reach the other planets and can return safely. But that is what this is what really, I think at core, can be said to be Hamilton's report on manufacturers, is for his day the equivalent of a crash program on fusion energy. It's a crash program to accelerate the economy of the new United States. The report was written in 1791. Hamilton himself, Alexander Hamilton, you may be thinking of some guy with gray hair or wearing one of those wigs or whatever. He was 34 years old at the time. He'd been through the American Revolution as a artillery commander and a battalion commander and as Washington's aide-de-camp, and served in the Congress. He had played an absolutely critical role in the Constitution and then led the campaign for the ratification of the U.S. Constitution in 1788, and then had become Treasury Secretary in the United States. And so these reports followed in rapid succession, months apart. And this is the last report in December of 1791, the report on manufacturers. Just one final note. I think in the last, yesterday, we held in Germany, Essen, Germany, a remarkable conference, and really an echo of it in New York City as well, with Jason Ross in New York City with the American Society of Civil Engineers there in New York City. But in Essen, Germany, and we'll put a picture of it up here, just the picture that we have so far from the event. We held a seminar, a Schiller Institute seminar, which featured a leading representative, the charge d'affaires of the Embassy of the People's Republic of China in Germany, the director of the Center for International Energy Strategy for the China Institute for International Studies, the former president of the German Steel Federation of Dusseldorf, one of the leading members and fellows of the Society of Manufacturing Engineers of the United States, and on the board of the Laser Institute, lasers as in industrial processes. Jacques Cheminade, the presidential candidate of France, the consul general from Ethiopia to Frankfurt, Germany, one of the leading developers of mag-lead transportation from Germany, who's also has been a consulting scientist to the Tongji University in Shanghai on mag-lead developments for the last several decades. And the conference was led off by Helga LaRouche, the founder of the Scheller Institute and the current president of the Scheller Institute. And the conference was on the subject, the potential of the world land bridge for Germany. Likewise in New York, Jason Ross, our colleague, member of the policy committee of LaRouche PAC and part of the science team, LaRouche science team, was the guest lecturer before the American Society of Civil Engineers in New York on the world land bridge. First, on the new Suez Canal, the doubling of the capacity of the Suez Canal that was completed a year ago in 1 year, financed internally by the government of Egypt. And then after dinner, a presentation on the world land bridge itself. And this really is the impetus. This is the revival of the Hamiltonian perspective. So we'll go to Alexander Hamilton now, and I think first of all, this is what he looked like in 1791. Next slide. This is I thought to start with the conclusion of the report on manufacturers, summing up what he saw as really what was required. In countries where there is great private wealth, much may be affected by the voluntary contributions of patriotic individuals. But in a community situated like that of the United States, the public purse must supply the deficiency of private resource. In what can it be so useful as in prompting and improving the efforts of industry? All which is humbly submitted to Alexander Hamilton, Treasury, Secretary of the U.S. Treasury. So now we'll go to the beginning of this report. And the beginning of the report, the context is, we discussed this last week, but I'll frame this presentation again with these remarks. The battle was on in the United States between the slave power of the South, but also of the Tory faction inside the United States generally, centered in New York and otherwise in Boston, and what you can term the New York administration, the leadership out of New York, centered around the individuals who had been with Washington, George Washington at Valley Forge, which included Hamilton, Gouverneur Morris, others such as John Marshall and so forth. And the question was the direction the country was going to take. Many of these individuals, Hamilton included, were founding members of the Manumission Society in New York. That is, to do away with, to abolish slavery. So this, from the very inception, not later on, not with the Missouri Compromise, but from the very beginning, the battle for the United States was a battle to overcome the legacy of slavery, dating back at least to the Roman Empire, to really create a sovereign democratic republic for the first time in mankind's history, at least our known history. And the opposition to what Hamilton had laid out in this seamless series of papers on the public credit, which was immediately instituted by Congress, restoring the public credit, which we discussed last week, so I'm not going to recapitulate that here. The follow-on to that in terms of the National Bank, which again was immediately passed with a hot debate, with a real fight in this case, but was passed and signed by George Washington into law. And now with the report on manufacturers, this battle heated up further in terms of the opposition to manufacturing, the opposition specifically to the government playing a critical role in directing the development of manufacturing. And so here we have, I've added these titles here at the top. I hope they don't distract. But Hamilton starts out his paper which was requested by President Washington and the Congress, in that the U.S. had to develop the supplies, the domestic supplies, to ensure its national security, its military supplies. That was the immediate reason for the report. And Hamilton came back in this report to say, we've got to address the agrarian question. We have to address the question of agriculture and its relation to manufacturing. We have to go at this issue of whether this country is going to be half free, half slave, which of course it can't be, or whether it's going to develop and emerge as a democratic republic, as intended. And so here you have, we'll just read this quickly. He's offering first, well, here are the opinions of those who are still opposed to manufacturing in the United States. There still are, he says. These are in quotes because he's presenting these as arguments that are out there. These are not his words, but he's summarizing the arguments that are being made, including he knows that will be made on the floor of the U.S. Congress. There still are, nevertheless, respectable patrons of opinions unfriendly to the encouragement of manufacturers. The following are substantially the arguments by which these opinions are defended. In every country, say those who entertain them, agriculture is the most beneficial and productive object of human industry. Well, this position, generally, if not universally true, applies with particular emphasis to the United States on account of their immense tracts of fertile territory, uninhabited and unimproved. Nothing can so afford so advantageous an employment of capital and labor as the conversion of this extensive wilderness into cultivated farms. Nothing equally with this can contribute to the population strength and real riches of the country. Can continue with the next one. To endeavor by the extraordinary patronage of government to accelerate the growth of manufactures is, in fact, to endeavor by force and art to transfer the natural current of industry from a more to a less beneficial channel. Whatever has such a tendency must necessarily be unwise. Indeed, it can hardly ever be wise in a government to attempt to give a direction to the industry of its citizens. Where have we heard that before? From Goldman Sachs, perhaps? Yes. This under the quick-sighted guidance of private interests, well, if left to itself, the quick-sighted guidance of private interests, well, if left to itself, infallibly find its own way to the most profitable employment. And 'tis by such employment that the public prosperity will be most effectually promoted. Now, I want to, he's
Original trickle down.
yes, he's drawing on Adam Smith here, very directly. In fact, in the report on manufacturers, he quotes Adam Smith, in the sense of setting up an argument to be knocked down. So the question of whether the founding fathers were in opposition to Adam Smith, who now, at least at economics departments, is touted as somehow having been the seminal thinker of free market economics upon which the American system was based. is completely fraudulent. It's a complete inversion of reality. But I want to just sidelight here, but very relevant. I want to quote briefly from the theory of moral sentiments, a strange formulation, at least to the modern ear. The theory of moral sentiments by Adam Smith. This was written before his Wealth of Nations. But you'll see the parallel with what's said here, and I hope why I'm bringing this into the discussion that will be apparent. I'll just quote Mr. Smith. The administration of the great system of the universe, however, the care of the universal happiness of all rational and sensible creatures, is the business of God and not of man. To man is allotted a much humbler department, but one more suitable to the weakness of his powers and to the narrowness of his comprehension. The care of his own happiness and of that of his family, his friends, his country, that he is occupied in contemplating the more sublime, can never be an excuse for his neglecting the more humble departments. And he must not expose himself to the charge which Avidius Clausius is said to have brought, perhaps unjustly, against Marcus Antonius, that while he employed himself in philosophical speculations and contemplated the prosperity of the universe, he neglected that of the Roman Empire. The most sublime speculation of the contemplative philosopher can scarce compensate the neglect of the smallest active duty. That last part may have gotten a little obtuse, but the point is there in the concept. To man is allotted a much humbler department than the care of universal happiness. Now compare that to the preamble of the U.S. Constitution. Compare or contrast. That the purpose of forming a nation is for the sake of promoting life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. In fact, really taking a page from Aeschylus and Prometheus, we were challenging, our founding fathers were challenging us to bring fire to man, to take responsibility for our own future, our own destiny, to create our own destiny. And so this is this physiocratic view, the view that we must accept a smaller capacity, a smaller role, is challenged by Hamilton, but is what is being put forward here as the opposition to the Hamilton economic reforms. Let's go to the next. And so it continues. To these disadvantages for the prosecution of manufacturers, of deficiency of pecuniary capital being added, the prospect of a successful competition with the manufacturers of Europe must be regarded as little less than desperate. In other words, don't try to compete with the big boys. Accept our position. It's exactly what's been told to countries like the Philippines, the nations of Africa, and so forth, by the IMF and World Bank in recent decades. Extensive manufactures can only be the offspring of a redundant, at least of a full population, till the latter shall characterize the situation of this country. 'Tis vain to hope for the former. If contrary to the natural course of things, an unseasonable and premature spring can be given to certain fabrics by heavy duties, prohibitions, bounties, or by other forced expedients, this will only be to sacrifice the interests of the community to those of particular classes. Besides the misdirection of labor, a virtual monopoly will be given to the persons employed on such fabrics. He's not speaking of fabrics simply in terms of clothing. It's a more general term for manufacturers. An enhancement of price, the inevitable consequence of every monopoly, and so on and so forth. So this is his argument. You can continue. Okay, so here's Hamilton's response. He says we have to examine this more carefully. This mode of reasoning is founded upon facts and principles which have certain respectable pretensions. If it had governed the conduct of nations more generally than it has done, there is room to suppose that it might have carried them faster to prosperity and greatness. In other words, basically nobody else has followed this path. You know, we're being told this is the path we should accept. Well, if we actually step back and examine, you know, Europe, the countries of Europe, for example, they didn't follow this path. Continue on. It ought readily to be conceded that the cultivation of the earth as the primary and most certain source of national supply, as the immediate and chief source of subsistence to man, as the principal source of those materials which constitute the nutriments of other kinds of labor, as including a state most favorable to the freedom and independence of the human mind, one perhaps most conducive to the multiplication of the human species, has intrinsically a strong claim to preeminence, but this is that it has a title to anything like it as an exclusive predilection in any country ought to be admitted with great caution. And if we're going to say that it's more productive than other branches of industry, well then we've got to make this clear. You can see the rest. I assume you're skimming ahead. Why don't we go on? I don't want to put anybody to sleep here. You need to read and study Hamilton for yourself. But the point I think I want to make here is Hamilton is taking you through these arguments. He's taking every citizen through these arguments. These papers were not just written for some people in Congress. These circulated widely. They were like the Federalist Papers. These were subject to debate and deliberation and arguments in the newspapers and so on. And so he is taking people through the arguments of the day, because this is the fate of the country rest of it, right? You know, if you blow it, you've blown it. You know, and the U.S. at that point, you know, coming out of complete and utter bankruptcy after the American Revolution, had no wiggle room. So we had the restoration of the public credit, we had a national bank in place, but now how are we going to utilize that credit? How are we going to move forward? Well, some are saying, no, just let it all sort itself out. And Hamilton's saying, no, first of all, for the purpose of national security, we can't do this. But also, more importantly, what are the principles involved? What is the truth of the matter? How does man advance?
Brian, can you define parsimony?
Saving, skimping, you know.
That's parsimonious, yes.
Yeah.
It's a parsimony to noun.
Right. The quote unquote agrarian argument. To use the term agrarian is better to say that the pro-slavery argument was that manufacturers general, in what we would call industry today, contributed nothing to the wealth of the nation. That all wealth was derived from that transformation of nature in agriculture. And then all manufacturer was doing was making, was manipulating the form, but it wasn't adding anything. And if anything, might represent a net drain on the resources of the country. And if there was any nominal progress that could be attributed to manufacture, it was from the form of parsimony, from skimping. That so and so could skimp and set aside a little money, and therefore they could make something work that didn't work before, but it didn't fundamentally alter the actual nature of the processes involved. Right? Where Hamilton is arguing, no, that in fact what we're dealing with here is actually the productive powers of man, creativity, human creativity. We're going to establish this as the principle. Go ahead. I'm going to keep moving here. I'd like people to refrain from questions, and I don't mind a comment here or a laugh or whatever, but to keep things on track. If you can just hold your questions and comments to the end, otherwise. Here is Hamilton. That the annual produce of the land and labor of a country can only be increased in two ways: by some improvement in the productive powers of the useful labor, which actually exists within it, or by some increase in the quantity of such labor. That with regard to the first, the labor of artificers, that is, those that work in manufacturing, as opposed to those, that they are otherwise defined as the really productive people by the slave power. Being capable of greater subdivision and simplicity of operation than that of the cultivators, it is susceptible in a proportionable greater degree of improvement in its productive powers, whether to be derived from an accession of skill or from the application of ingenious machinery, in which particular, therefore, the labor employed in the culture of land can pretend to no advantage over that engaged in manufactures. That with regard to the augmentation of the quantity of useful labor, this, excluding adventitious circumstances, special circumstances, must depend essentially upon an increase of capital, which again must depend upon the savings made out of the revenues of those who furnish it or manage that, which is at any time employed, whether in agriculture or in manufactures or in any other way. It's what you bring to bear on the process. But the question is the productive powers of labor. And productive powers of labor is not just muscle labor, right? It's creative ingenuity, it's the application of that, the utilization of ingenious machinery, and so forth. Go ahead. And so this is an argument, I think we'll skip over it for the sake, but he's basically showing in an argument, and you can read it, he takes 3 or 4 pages to just go through it very carefully and systematically, that while, yes, the manufacturer consumes a equal value of the produce of the land, he and his family, as the farmer and his family, it is not the case that he does not contribute to the total production of the economy.
One second, I'm sorry. Well, we are in the same argument still, right? About the manufacturing growth versus productivity.
Right.
Okay. I just want to make sure we weren't going to another argument.
No.
Okay.
No. This is still Hamilton answering the arguments of the agrarian, the physiocratic arguments, right? Arguing for the productivity of the artificer, of the manufacturer. Clear? Okay. Go ahead. I'm just skimming over this. Go on to the next. Now, I want to step back a second. This is the Saugus Ironworks in Massachusetts. And I'm bringing this up to say that, in fact, we weren't starting with Alexander Hamilton. John Winthrop the Younger, the son of the founder of the Massachusetts Bay Colony, had launched the Saugus Ironworks in 1646. So we're talking about 140, 150 years before the report on manufacturers. And that ironworks operated from 1646 to 1670 before essentially the British, that then controlled the colonies, right? Shut it down. Basically made it ineffectual and unable to operate. But this was the first integrated ironworks in the New World. It was on a scale, you can go to the next, it was on a scale equivalent to the best in Europe at that time. Winthrop Jr. had gone to Europe, gone to the lowland countries, drew on the best technology, brought over the best people he could find to collaborate. So this involved blast furnace, forge, rolling mill, shear, slitter, and a quarter-pound drop hammer, all in an integrated system. I won't get into the details of it.
Quarter ton, right?
About a quarter pound.
Quarter ton. Thank you. Thank you. Quarter ton. Continue. So I'm just bringing this up because even though the Saugus Iron Works existed for only this short period of time, 24 years, the workers from Saugus then dispersed. They and their families, they and their kin, then opened up other iron works around the country. So there was a history of this process. So there was a knowledge of manufacturing, not something simply that we knew at a distance from across the ocean, that had been applied in terms of our own history. But it's also I think useful to keep this in mind because we forget how long a period of time it was between 1630, when the Massachusetts Bay Colony was started, when they landed, and when the American Revolution began in 1776, right, 146 years later, and then even further to the 1791 and the Report on Manufactures. So this fight had been going on for a long time. Okay, so all right, so now he comes in the Report on Manufactures to an enumeration of the ways in which manufacturing establishments augment the produce and revenue of the society. That it's not only a fair exchange with agriculture, but there's a net gain, and these are the means by which this occurs. The first being what he already referenced, the division of labor. Secondly, the extension of the use of machinery. Third, the additional employment to classes of the community not ordinarily engaged in the business. That is, you have people that may have physical limitations, or skills, or lack of skills, and so forth, that can be utilized in manufacturers that might not be able to work in a farm setting. The promotion of immigration. This is extremely important, something that Hamilton was involved in directly, was in recruiting, as Treasury Secretary, in recruiting skilled workers, including from England, where you had to do it surreptitiously because it was illegal for skilled workers from England to leave, much less with plans or drawings or, knowledge. I mean, there were strict limits. They were attempting to keep, the machinery, the knowledge of the machinery of the spinning machines and so forth, secret. So Hamilton was directly involved in directly contracting with individuals to bring them over to the United States. But more generally, that the development of manufacturing would attract from abroad a growing population to the United States, which the new United States desperately needed and wanted. So this would help our agriculture as well. Fifth, the furnishing of a greater scope for the diversity of talents and dispositions which discriminate men from each other. We're different. We have different capabilities. Sixth, the affording a more ample and various field for enterprise. We'll come back to that in a second. Seven, the creating, in some instances, a new and securing in all a more certain and steady demand for the surplus produce of the soil itself. And we'll come back to that. We'll go to the next one. Promoting immigration. I think that I summarized it already, that there's people that would come, but they're not, they need some guarantee. Skilled workers in Europe that would seek out to come to the New World if they knew that there was a job there, that there was security and so forth. Go ahead, go to the next one. Continue on with this one. Here we go. This is going to number 6 that we just went through. As to the affording a more ample and various field for enterprise. And here we go to the heart of Hamilton's thinking, which we'll gain more insight into as we go along. This also is of greater consequence in the general scale of national exertion than might perhaps on a superficial view be supposed, and has effects not altogether dissimilar from those of the circumstance last noticed. Here's the key. To cherish and stimulate the activity of the human mind, by multiplying the objects of enterprise is not among the least considerable of the expedients by which the wealth of a nation may be promoted. Even things in themselves not positively advantageous sometimes become so by their tendency to provoke exertion. Every new scene which is open to the busy nature of man to rouse and exert itself is the addition of a new energy to the general stock of effort. The spirit of enterprise, useful and prolific as it is, must necessarily be contracted or expanded in proportion to the simplicity and variety of the occupations and productions which are to be found in a society. It must be less in a nation of mere cultivators than in a nation of cultivators and merchants. Less in a nation of cultivators and merchants than in a nation of cultivators, artificers, and merchants. Go back to the last one. Just that again, just that one sentence really. To cherish and stimulate the activity of the human mind by multiplying the objects of enterprise is not among the least considerable of the expedients by which the wealth of a nation may be promoted. And this is the heart of the American system. All right, continue on. This just again, this gives you just a further sense of how detailed Hamilton is being in presenting his arguments. He's making the point here that in fact we can't rely on the export of the produce of the soil abroad because we're excluded from commercial operations abroad.
Right.
The markets in Europe aren't open to American agricultural products. They produce their own. They'll buy it from us when they need it, but when they can produce their own, when they have a bountiful crop and so forth, forget about it, right? So therefore, how do we pay for those imports we require if we can't export, if you're limited to agriculture? All of that is changed by manufacturers, both because you can produce for yourself, but it's also a growing array of what you can export, right? You're no longer limited to agricultural products. So there's no other expedient but to promote, not just let it happen, not just let it all hang out, but to promote it, to promote manufacturing establishments. Because we're working under a deadline. We're working under conditions where we've got to make certain things happen. Or we're not going to be around for very long. Continue. I think we'll go ahead. Yeah, the same. Yeah. I mean, go back to the last one. Because a constant, halfway down there, a constant and increasing necessity on their part for the commodities of Europe and only a partial and occasional demand for their own in return could not be but expose them to a state of impoverishment. This is what I was just saying in terms of their reliance on agriculture. Compared with the opulence with which their political and natural advantages authorize them to aspire. In other words, they're going to end up importing luxuries and going broke in the process of doing it. Remarks of this kind are not made in the spirit of complaint. 'Tis for the nations whose regulations are alluded to judge for themselves whether by aiming at too much they do not lose more than they gain. 'Tis for the United States to consider by what means they can render themselves least dependent on the combinations, right or wrong, of foreign policy. Okay. And this addresses this question of that other countries, you see here, certain nations grant bounties on the exportation of particular commodities. In other words, if we say we're going to set up manufacturers, we're going to be dealing in that domain as well with the fact that other countries provide bounties and other rewards for manufacturing in their own country. So our prices are not going to be able to meet their prices under these conditions. Go ahead. And so these combinations, to frustrate the efforts to introduce it into another, this is something we're going to have to overcome, and this is the role of government. The existence or assurance of aid from the government of the country in which the business is to be introduced may be essential to fortify adventurers against the dread of such combinations that they're going to face from abroad, or to go into competition abroad, to defeat their effects if formed, and to prevent their being formed by demonstrating that they must in the end prove fruitless. Okay, and this is answering, as you can tell from the title, the idea that there's going to be a shortage of hands. If you develop manufacture, then there won't be enough people on the land. Right? And he's answering this, I think from what we've already discussed. Do I need to go through this? I mean, this is pretty obvious. Go ahead. Go to the next one. Too much.
I think that's important.
Okay. Okay, the difference of price in two countries of a given quantity of manual labor. The cost of that labor can be reduced by mechanic power. So that something that the price of a given good that might be 10 can be reduced to 5 and so forth. Mechanic labor becomes an important factor in this. And how do you promote the use of machinery? Go on to the next. And in utilizing machinery and utilizing bounties and so forth, then companies utilizing capital can pay wages, higher wages. And so that the effect of the development of manufacturing is to actually to increase wages, not, as the slander was put about, was that the development of manufacturers were going to suppress the standard of living of the population. Go ahead. Okay, go ahead. Go ahead. And likewise, in terms of the argument of monopoly, that the role of government would be to give to certain people the advantages, these advantages being given to particular classes at the expense of the rest of the community. And he answers this by saying that indeed, well, we'll just kind of pick it up here. Who it is affirmed would be able to procure the requisite supplies of manufactured articles on better terms from foreigners than from our own citizens, and who it is alleged are reduced to the necessity of paying an enhanced price for whatever they want by every measure which obstructs the free competition of foreign commodities. It is not an unreasonable supposition that measures which serve to abridge the free competition of foreign articles have a tendency to occasion an enhancement of prices, and it is not to be denied that such is the effect in a number of cases, but the fact does not uniformly correspond with the theory. A reduction of prices has in several instances immediately succeeded the establishment of domestic manufacturing, freeing you from dependence on foreign manufacturing. Whether it be that foreign manufacturers endeavor to supplant by underselling our own, or whatever else may be the cause, the effect has been such as is stated, and the reverse of what might have been expected. But though it were true that the immediate and certain effects of regulations controlling competition of foreign with domestic fabrics was an increase of price, it is universally true that the contrary is the ultimate effect with every successful manufacturer. The prices drop. But there's a deeper point here. The point is, Hamilton is not in this paper trying to lay out, here's rule 1, here's rule 2, here's rule 3, and we're going to put these in concrete, and this is how we're going to run the show. He's saying, okay, this is what we need to do. These are the principles we have to apply. These are principles that we can see can be applied, but we're going to apply them when necessary, and we can remove them when they're not. right? When manufacturers develop and they're on their own feet, we don't have to provide them bounties anymore, and so on and so forth. We don't have to create monopolies. Go ahead. In other words, we have to create a nation, and that means to continually create anew how we order that nation. Then there's additional reasons for government patronage that he develops here. Go ahead. You can just skim through this. Go ahead. Go ahead. Okay, go ahead. And then he gets to the means, and this is where I'm going to leave off the discussion for today. Having reviewed the inducements that can promote manufacture in terms of tariffs, restrictions on imports, bounties, and so forth. Now, let's a full view having now been taken of the inducements to the promotion of manufacturers in the United States, Hamilton says, accompanied with an examination of the principal objections, which are commonly urged in opposition. It is proper in the next place to consider the means by which it might be effected in introduction to a specification of the objects, which in the present state of things, the present state, appear the most fitting to be encouraged, and of the particular measures which it may be advisable to adopt in respect to each. And so he begins with protecting duties. And as we discussed last week, tariffs were among the first thing imposed in the United States. Go ahead. The first one is the duties on imports, on foreign articles. Second, prohibitions of rival articles were required. Prohibitions on the export of materials. That is, if materials are required domestically, we can't allow those goods to be exported, and then our own manufacturers no longer have access to them, right? Just because they can get a higher price in England, in Manchester or something. So prohibitions on the export of certain materials required for manufacturers. Bounties, pecuniary bounties, which can be applied individually to companies or to classes of product. Premiums as rewards for exemplary production and so forth. And the exemption of the materials of manufacturers from duty. That is, if we have to import, if goods are prevented from coming in, but in some cases those goods are being imported to fill, say, a raw materials need for manufacturers, then those duties should be withdrawn, right, for those imports. Drawbacks, that's the drawing back of duties, which I just mentioned. The encouragement of new inventions and discoveries at home, that this is part of government's role. Government has to foster this. And of the introduction in the United States of such as may have been made in other countries, particularly those which relate to machinery. In other words, we're going to engage in, what's the modern day term for
intellectual property.
Intellectual property, right? We're going to steal intellectual property, or we'll pay for them where we have to, but we're going to go after, and we're going to encourage this, and this is significantly in terms of immigrant labor, to bring skilled labor in that knows skills that we don't have. That this is important as well as inventions and discoveries. Judicious regulations of the inspection of manufactured commodities. Here he's concerned that our own commodities have to have a certain standard. We can't be producing nails that don't nail. we can't be producing junk. And so, but he's saying a judicious inspection process, not a heavy-handed operation. But there's got to be, that this is something that has to be considered seriously. Pecuniary remittances from place to place. Of course, you're talking about goods moving around the country. This is addressed by the National Bank. The ability to move money, to buy and sell, to allow raw materials to reach the manufacturer, for manufactured goods to reach the market. This has been set up and created by the formation of the National Bank and its branches, its 8 branch offices. This facilitating of the transport of commodities. Here goes to roads, canals, and so forth. But these are necessary as the context. So all of this being presented, this is the first half of the report on manufacturers, and then he gets into the specifics into cotton and iron and so on, and we'll come back to that next week. But we would be remiss to not talk about you could call it the modern Saugus ironworks in terms of principle that Hamilton was involved in. This is the Passaic Falls on the Passaic River, which is by what's now Paterson, New Jersey. The town of Paterson exists because of Alexander Hamilton. In 1791, and he refers to it, jumping ahead, I'll just read. He's in the report on manufacturers, he reports on what he's up to here. He says, remember, this is the report to Congress. How much has been already done has been stated in a preceding part of this report. In addition to this, it must be announced that a society is forming with a capital which is expected to be extended to at least $500,000. That's a huge sum. Right? The entire, capital of the Bank of America was, or the National Bank of the United States was $10 million. So, of $500,000, on behalf of which measures are already in train for prosecuting on a large scale the making and printing of capital of cotton goods. Okay, and this was the formation initiated by Hamilton in 1791 of the Society for the Establishment of Useful Manufactures. And in 1792, the site was chosen, which is now Paterson, New Jersey. And from the state, not from the federal government, but from the state, this Society for the Establishment of Useful Manufactures was given a freedom from all taxes and duties in perpetuity for setting itself up to create a modern textile complex, from spinning to cloth making, sail making, and so on and so forth, and the development of a town in conjunction with this. Above the falls here on the Passaic River, it was dammed up, a reservoir was created. Go to the next, and that reservoir, this is more what it looked like at the time without the bridge that was added later, but go ahead. This was the facility built by the Society for the Establishment of Useful Manufacturers that was financed. There's a number of individuals that came together in collaboration with Hamilton. Hamilton wasn't an owner, so far as I know, of a piece of it, but he was the instigator of this process. And his Bank of New York helped finance this project. But this 4-story building was the complex for both the mill driven by the river, that came down a sluice, to drive the wheels, which drove the gears, which provided the power for the spinning mills and so forth, that ultimately produced the cloth and the rest. So this was built, and this began operation in, I think it was 1794 was when it began operation. But this was a facility to be a model for similar projects, industrial complexes built around the country. Paterson, what's now Paterson, New Jersey, on the Passaic River. Around the country. This was what Hamilton was in direct. This is part of this science driver concept that Hamilton had in terms of rapidly advancing the industrial capacities of the United States, but driven by the development of the creative capacities, the productive capacities of its population, utilizing national credit, utilizing the government to propel this process. So I think that's a good place to stop for the presentation. So we can stop here. Now, We'll take some questions and answers, and then for those who can take some time, very importantly, Keisha Rogers is here, and she's going to lead a discussion, a roundtable reading of Hamilton's National Bank, to begin the reading of Hamilton's National Bank paper that we discussed last week, but to actually read it. And so after some back and forth here, we'll move it immediately to that. Is that fair? All right. So you can turn on the light. Questions, comments? Just so you understand, I was trying to, we're around the country, we're making these presentations and doing these readings of Hamilton. In Manhattan and San Francisco and Boston and Seattle and so on and so forth. And so this week I tried much more to incorporate the actual text. So if it was a bit dry, I apologize, but it was to actually work to take you through the conceptualization that Hamilton himself was out to produce in his readers among the citizens.
He wasn't drawing.
Good.
You know, I have like this question: parsimony versus productive powers. Isn't that also the difference between the obsession with balancing the budget and paying down the debt, you know, versus some sort of concept of investing in the future?
Well, it comes from the same source, you know, inside the personality. It's not what he's referring to in this context, in that section of the report of manufacture.
But there was this thing that some English or Financial Times or something, some guy this week, where they're talking about China's going to have an infrastructure-driven economic crash somehow or other, right? Because they go through all these and they're not making any money. They're not making any money, right? So these guys can't conceive of why would you build a bridge unless you can put a toll booth at the end of it. You know, the same thing with the space program. We shouldn't have a space program unless we can make money on it, right? And so their concept of wealth, it's just money.
Well, I would just add that it's not their concept of wealth. Most fundamentally, it's what they want you to believe is the concept of wealth. That you have to obey these rules, you know, this quick turnaround, fast buck rules, which of course guarantee that you're not going anywhere, you know, as a nation or as a community. As Paul Gallagher was pointing out and commenting on this study, which came out of Oxford this last week, that Joe was just referring to, you know, on how China is making these long-term investments, you know, in over 17,000 kilometers of high-speed rail, building entire new cities, you know, the One Belt, One Road, extending this with over $1 trillion of investments so far into Central Asia and beyond, that this loses money. Well, of course, in the short term, these projects like the Transcontinental Railroad across the United States only pay off over decades of their use. That's the point. You know, it's an investment up front, which then pays back. It's not a question of money. It's a question of the wealth resulting from the utilization of that energy, that water, that transport system, and so forth, to the increasing productivity of the nation of the whole. As LaRouche says, those can be specified. Those can be, you know, the so-called LaRouche, as one of our Russian friends named it. You know, the question of increasing relative population potential density. Increasing relative population potential density is the measure of your society's durable capacity for survival, for development. Its ability to support a growing population on a given area of land, combined with increasing energy flux density in the utilization of power as physical measures of this process of real wealth creation, which can then be used to retire, of course, paper debt, credit, so forth, as a result, consequence. It's a good point, Joe. Comments, questions? So we'll come back to the report on manufacturers. next week. And the report on manufacturers never passed the U.S. Congress. It never even had a full hearing in the U.S. Congress. While Hamilton's other acts or papers to the Congress were the basis of the restoration of the national credit, the creation of the national bank, and so forth, the report on manufacturers was stonewalled. And we'll get into some of the consequences, not in detail, but we'll get into some of the consequences. But enough was done, enough was set in motion through, in particular, the National Bank and its extension of credit, and the way in which the National Bank was guided, at least to a degree, that the process that there was a process of progress unleashed in the country. But as we know from history, with dire consequences, in the sense of the way in which it was cut short.
Oh, what was the national debt of the United States after the Revolutionary War?
The total debt was about $80 million. Only about, if I recall, less than 20, I think it was close to 15 million, was the entire foreign debt of the country. The state debt of the states, the 13 colonies, each had their own debt, with a total of $25 million. And they had no way of paying it off because their currencies, because they all had their own currencies and so forth, their own bills of credit had circulated, and so they were basically flat busted. And then the remainder of that, so it'd be another 35 roughly, 37 million was the national debt, domestic debt. That was what was reorganized through the issuance of a new bond, in which the old debt, all of this debt, foreign debt, state debt, so it was taken in as payment. You could buy the new bonds with your old bonds, and the new bonds guaranteed a 5 or 6% return. Plus, you might get land, or you could get a portion of land and a portion of payment over, like an annuity over time. All these different. There was different options, but because that new bond was tied to specific revenue streams like tariffs, excise taxes, and so forth, there was a guaranteed revenue stream to circulate those bonds, and those bonds then circulated as financial paper. They were dollars. They were the currency of the day. Suddenly, virtually overnight, because they sold out, these new bonds sold out overnight, suddenly there was millions of dollars of currency, or equivalent of what we would today call currency, we call dollars or Federal Reserve notes, circulating, which were viewed as good as gold. And so suddenly the country that had no liquidity, had no ability to buy, where land values had collapsed by 25 to 50%, and so on and so forth, suddenly was revived. The economy was revived. A very important part of the story. We covered a lot of that last week, but it's a good question.
I mean, Hamilton himself, in this period, there's all kinds of, Jefferson.
Jefferson, Madison, that was the.
They were going after him for speculating and for encouraging this crazy banking and stuff like that. So, I mean, it's a real hot political fight over whether or not this is going to be effective.
Yes.
And they weren't really interested in it being effective. They were just against it because they didn't want the development. Yeah,
I read that quote last week. If I can find it again quickly. This is Jefferson writing to a correspondent in the Netherlands. He says, "If I indulge my own theory, I would wish the United States to practice neither commerce nor navigation, but to stand with respect to Europe precisely on the footing of China." Not China today, China. In his own time. Without any manufacturing. As a feudal state. So yeah, we'll discuss some of that back and forth. But yeah, it was a real ongoing battle. Jefferson, Madison, Monroe, absolutely. This was the slave power of Virginia and Maryland. These were the enemies of the American system. Bob Ingram's groundbreaking work on this is readily available, and if you'd like to get a link to it, it can readily be made available. Manhattan's struggle for human freedom against the slave power of Virginia is the history of this up to almost the Civil War.
Wasn't that in the EIR?
Yes, in the EIR,
Oh.
but it's on the websites otherwise, and we can get it to you. Just let us know, and we can send you the link. Detailing a lot of that fight. But also, there's the continuity. Isaac Roosevelt was Hamilton's partner in the Bank of New York that financed the society that I was speaking of, the establishment of manufacturers. Isaac Roosevelt became the president of the Bank of New York for a while. Well, this is the great-great-grandfather of Franklin Roosevelt.
Oh, he's the great-great-grandfather?
Of Franklin Roosevelt.
How do you like that?
On the male side, straight line right on through, and that's and Franklin Roosevelt wrote about Isaac Roosevelt, in college for one of his papers, major, was for studies. So I mean, this was he knew the history of his.
Was that taken over by the Mellon?
Yeah, that's the New York NYC Mellon Bank today. That is the Bank of New York of Hamilton. Nominally, it's the.
I was thinking about why LaRouche now is focusing on, more emphatically than ever, Alexander Hamilton, and why the fight to basically be mean and to make Hamilton into something that he's not is more emphatic from the enemies of mankind right now. And at the beginning, you were talking about, everybody knows about this Hamilton musical, Hamilton the rapper, rock star, and it's completely insane that you would have people like George W. Bush and Obama who bailed out Wall Street, continue to bail out Wall Street, continue to represent the interests that, killed Hamilton, the interests of the slave owning, in agrarian anti-manufacturing. And so it's, what LaRouche has really done is now put the battle right out front. This is not something that happened in past history to dust off your own.
Do you want to come up here and address?
Well, yeah, because I'm.
No, I think it's important what you're raising. I think.
Think about it, because it's very. I mean, the material you went through is pretty dense, and it's challenging to most people in our society right now because, first of all, most people, especially growing up, the younger generation, the productivity of society has been based on how much derivatives, how much money, how much fictitious banking, fraudulent banking you can create.
How many credit cards?
How many credit cards you have, right? How many credit cards your mom and dad gave you, and how much inheritance you have. It's nothing to do with actually the very key point we made or pointed out from Alexander Hamilton, stimulating the creative identity of the human mind. And so I'm thinking about, that what LaRouche is saying right now is we have to find in society right now those people who can rise up to that level of identity, of creative identity that requires a change in the thinking, a change in the culture. I was thinking about this Hamilton musical rap star show or whatever you call it, and saying, wow, what might have been interesting about that is if, one, they made it into an opera, but more so, yeah, at 256 exactly. more importantly, that it was true to the identity of human creativity and what it is that fosters a productive society, a creative society that increases the general welfare of every single person. Because one thing that Hamilton goes through explicitly in the report on manufacturing is that all of this is to the purpose of stimulating the creativity of the human mind and fostering the productivity of the human mind to increase the productivity and output of society. But he also talks about it from the standpoint of, actually enhancing and fostering what is identified in the preamble and the Declaration of Independence of our U.S. Constitution. The promotion of the happiness and the general welfare of the population. Now, we can have a whole debate on what that means and who has access to that, who should be happy and who should have access to, what is, the general welfare. Is that, you just have a bunch of people who are eating off the government and want free stuff, as some people would say. No, it is, but when you think about the fact that Linda LaRouche has been at the forefront of this fight. The battle is not over. The battle right now is that people believe that some people deserve to have happiness and some people deserve to have access to the productivity and be productive in society. And then some people are just useless eaters and they, take up too much time and space and resources of society. And there's not enough resources to go around for all of us. So you have, with the dwindling resources, and you have to figure out who is fit to survive. So, but that's contrary to what China is doing and saying right now, with the one increases of uplifting the population to the standard that Hamilton, and above the standard that Hamilton had set, the standard that was recognized in our U.S. Republic under George Washington, Abraham Lincoln, John Quincy Adams before him, that right now, how people say there was just a discussion that China is continuing to pull over 700 million people out of poverty plus right now and ongoing, and how are they doing this? They're definitely not doing it by saying, well, we got to stay in agrarian society. Right. They're definitely not doing it by, going with the banking policy of derivatives and speculation and bailing out a financial system that's crumbling. As a matter of fact, actually, China right now has a better Glass-Steagall standing and banking separation policy standing than we do. So why is that? Why are nations around the world right now looking to the standards of the United States that were the foundation, the true standards, the human standards of the United States, and then the United States itself has lost its understanding of that principle? So what we're doing right now is we have, 2 weeks before this puppet show election process continuing with this porn show. And if we don't get a certain standard set in the United States, then you can forget it. Obama's sitting there, on TV like, yeah, Hamilton's my man. he's a rap star and he don't know a damn thing. You know, it's like, what are you talking about? This guy hasn't read Hamilton a day in his life, and it's, you know, you should feel insulted. But the problem is that we can't feel insulted because we haven't done our homework. We don't know about what it is the true fight that has guided and shaped this nation, which is, as said, still ongoing. You know, people are still enslaved right now by the process of one monetary system that they continue to be enslaved by. So this is not easy stuff, but it's also not something that you can go and pull out as we used to do in college, where you want to go and get your Shakespearean Cliff Notes. It doesn't, you know, now this is a war. You know, is it going to be by the people who can really muster up the intellectual battle and actually saying we are going to live true to the identity of our American system, of what has been taken away, what people have been lied about. You know, this has been, and if it hadn't been for LaRouche and his collaborators, all of the crap that you're taught in your history books and so forth about the foundation of our nation would continue to be ongoing, and nobody would actually know the truth. So now the question is the fight for the truth, because you get a lot of stuff out there.
Well, not only that, but a lot of these things, because I put this book together from these things, and a lot of these things are at the American Enterprise Institute, places like that, and they have translated, you know, they put together, not translations, but they have edited texts, and they cut out all the parts that they want to put in the background, and they
right.
They miss the fact that misrepresent some of the words. You know, like the Yale Law School had this on the constitutionality of the
National Bank there,
right?
yeah.
And in there, one of the errors was that the Constitution was the serene law of the land instead of the supreme law of the land.
Oh,
anyway, there's all kinds of stuff like that. Yeah. And anyway, and people don't know because they just buzz over it and they miss all the.
Yeah. Yeah.
So what was the book that you were reading from, Brian?
The report on manufacturers.
Yeah, but who wrote it?
Hamilton.
I mean, yeah.
Alexander Hamilton.
Okay, I'm just asking for the edition.
Oh, no.
I'm
sorry, I didn't understand. The report on the reports of Alexander Hamilton, edited by Jacob E. as an elephant, Cook. And if you go to Abe Books or Amazon, you can find used copies for a couple bucks. And then with shipping, maybe you pay $5 or $6. But yeah. But Mike, as Mike was saying, we've now put up. If you go to Amazon, you can find how would you describe? It's not just Kindle. It's
it's Kindle.
Oh, it's Kindle. Kindle version with the four papers that are also in this book, but with Lynn's 4 laws as well, and an introduction.
Called The Vision of Hamilton.
Called The Vision of Hamilton. So that's also available in a Kindle edition, so you can have it on your tablet or smartphone or whatever.
You know I'm old-fashioned.
Okay. Betty's old-fashioned, she's saying. So you can get the book. Yeah. And we may be publishing a version of our own because this is out of print, the version I have here. So there's only so many copies available floating around. So we may soon be publishing our own, since Hamilton's papers are in the public domain. It's not, somebody doesn't have a copyright to it. So, and we do, and on our website as well. If you go to, I know at least if you go to LaRouchePack.com, you can find the 4 papers of Alexander Hamilton. You can read them online. You can download them for free. They're there.
You can also find the 4 laws of William LaRouche. If you look at those in context of each other, of what LaRouche, because LaRouche sets Hamilton's standards very precisely for what's needed today. You know, that how to apply it into action.
I started out with it, but it's good to come back to it.
Yeah.
Absolutely come back.
Yeah,
Joel.
At the PBS show, last night, with Henry Paulson.
Oh, Henry Paulson was on that
Henry Paulson.
Hamilton's America show on PBS last night.
Yes.
They brought Hank
Those are
Paulson, one of the swindlers of the 2009, 2008 bailout, right?
Treasury Secretary.
Treasury Secretary.
I
Oh.
agree with that. But in his quote, I remember he said that there's a direct line from Hamilton to Paulson
Oh, my God.
and the central bank.
Yeah, who his assassin.
Yeah, Aaron Burr of Chase Bank assassinated
Yeah, we
Alexander
should like
Hamilton.
figure out all of those, you know, you have the different slanders, if you will, of Alexander Hamilton. You know, he was a central banker, I mean, and it's how they describe central banking, and he had all of these various monetary policies that people attribute to him.
He created the bonds, they created the bond market, and then the stock market, and then all these things.
Yeah.
That's the way they put
Yeah,
it.
Jefferson, Monroe, Madison. I mean, they claimed that he was a British agent. At the time of the Jay Treaty, there was the so-called Jacobin riots, and Washington was being charged with being a British agent. You know, it was. And royalists, all of these arguments, they come from the slave faction.
Yeah, there's some of those weirdos in the 9/11 who think Hamilton was predecessor of the Federal Reserve.
Yeah.
With national bank.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Sure, and that's claimed by Wall Street to try to
Yeah, that's-
wrap themselves in the American flag, so to speak, you know,
But
to try
it
to
it says right on
themselves.
the JP Morgan Chase website, founded by Aaron Burr.
Oh, it does say
Yeah.
that?
Yep.
Oh,
Yeah,
wow.
at their museum, JP Morgan Chase has the dueling pistols that were used that the Burr's set of pistols, one of which Hamilton had, one which that killed Hamilton
Where's that museum?
in New York, Wall Street. That's where it is. That's where it is. Yeah. They-
But I think you should find something that disabilities and this, that have been passed down from textbooks to generations, and this that are current about how to interact with them.
Yeah, another slender I heard was that he was descended from rum runners.
Oh, rum runners?
Yeah.
You want-
Well,
I think we should probably close the meeting.